Okay, looks like we're still having our participants roll in. Thank you for attending, everyone. I'll give us a few more seconds before we get started. Okay, welcome to the Tax Facts Lunch and Learn hosted by Wyoming Tax Facts and the Equality State Policy Center. My name is Marissa Carpio, and I'm the Policy Director for the Equality State Policy Center. ESPC is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization advocating for fair election and transparent government in support of all of Wyoming's communities. I will be assisting mostly in the background with the questions and conversations that arise among the audience during the webinar. Please use the Q&A feature to ask the speakers any questions. There is an option to submit anonymously if you don't want your name attached to your question. You can use the chat feature to share resources, reactions, and participate in the conversation further. Please remain respectful in the chat and remember that this is not a confidential feature. And with that, I'll pass it along to Sue Summers to introduce herself and the speakers today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sue Summers, co-founder of Wyoming Tax Facts. We are Wyomingites committed to a stable economic future for our state by increasing tax literacy in our communities and promoting tax reform. I thank the Equality State Policy Center and Wyoming Community Foundation for making this series possible. And I'd like to introduce our guests. Former Governor Dave Freudenthal is the author of the 2022 book, Wyoming, the Paradox of Plenty, the Allure and Risk of a Mineral Economy. You might be familiar with Dave as Wyoming's 31st governor, serving from 2003 to 2011. But before that, he earned an economics degree at Amherst College in Massachusetts, worked for the state of Wyoming in the Department of Economic Planning, then for Governor Ed Herschler as state planning director. He earned a law degree at UW and spent some time in private practice. Wyoming Senator Cale has served in the state legislature since 1994, first in the House and since 1999 in the Senate, representing Fremont County. His long experience serving on and co-chairing the Joint Revenue Committee gives him in-depth knowledge of Wyoming tax policy. Cale currently serves as co-chairman of another committee he's had history with, Joint Corporations, Elections, and Political Subdivisions. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I don't see any questions in the chat just yet, so I could start with a question for Senator Case. When and why did you first become passionate about taxes and Wyoming tax policy?
Oh, that's a good one. So I've actually served on the Revenue Committee for a lot of years, but I think my very first year in the legislature was the year when Wyoming had a marked departure from previous times. We were coming on another bust, and we put in a sales tax for the first time. We raised it from 3% to 4%. That was under the Sullivan administration. It was something that Governor Sullivan sought, and we promised it'd be temporary. And that was really the last major tax change in our history. It's become very apparent as I served in the Revenue Committee that our tax structure is very different than other places. And then if you take a place like South Dakota, for example, they also don't have an income tax, but they're not a mineral-based economy, and their tax structure is incredibly different. And they're actually doing quite a bit better than we are right now, and have been repeatedly.
But you didn't. So was your time in the Revenue Committee early on, seeing these changes? Is that kind of what engaged you with these issues?
Well, I've seen us be desperate for funds. I've seen us balance the budget of the state of Wyoming on the death taxes collected from one individual that died in Jackson Hole. And I know what it feels like not to have money in the legislature and have to vote on a tax. I know that these things come around to get us. And I also know, Sue, that there are huge structural long-term reasons why Wyoming's not going to be able to enjoy these mineral taxes, right? The writing's been on the wall for quite some time, but it's only becoming more prolific. So if that doesn't bring you around to realize we've got to clean house and make some changes, I'm not sure what will. But the bottom line is every other state that has a different tax structure is doing better than we have. All our neighboring states have more population growth. We have almost none. Their economies have grown. We actually went negative for 10 years. So it's not working for us. If these low taxes were working and recruiting people to come and bring their businesses here, we would be booming. We're not.
Can you elaborate a little bit on what you mean by the structural weaknesses and structural deficit, I assume we're talking about?
Well, I think the major point is, and Governor Freudenthal brings it out in his book, we have enjoyed immense benefits from the mineral industry. And Wyoming has actually done a better job than any other place I know of. And I've worked in Nigeria, Venezuela, other states that are mineral driven. But we've done a better job of putting the money to work and making and having a successful government. There's no question about that. But on the other hand, we have not set us up for the future. It's a tenuous position. I think people are actually afraid to come here and bring their businesses because they know that it's not going to be working in the long run. We do not have tax structures that are in any sense sustainable. No one pays for their own way, and we get all sorts of mixed feelings about that. But we're a very entitled bunch, and I think you should let Governor Freudenthal tell us how.
Now
Well, and
that was a cheap trick. Go ahead, Sue.
we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. First one, in light of so many anti-tax legislators, what tools can be implemented to reform and enhance revenues in Wyoming? Any ideas?
And just adding on that, a similar question is, what do we do about Wyoming's continued trend and lack of appetite for meaningful tax reform? So I feel like both of those questions kind of go together.
Well, Governor, I'm going to turn this one to you, but the first thing I'm going to, before I do, we raised taxes in 1994, actually 1993, I think, because we were broke. We had to. We didn't have a choice. And that's when we dramatically increased the sales tax at that time from 3% to 4%. It seemed like the end of the world. I suspect that's what's going to happen when the end of the world comes again. But just a couple of years ago, we thought we were at the end of the world again when the oil prices were negative and we're coming into the COVID malaise, and it looked really, really bad. And if it wouldn't have been for plentiful federal funds that flowed from that, we would have had to raise taxes. We wouldn't have a choice, or we wouldn't have functional schools or any other services for people. That's what it comes down to.
Marissa, did you? Oh, I'm sorry, Governor. Please
No,
contribute.
go ahead.
Oh.
Well, I think to go a little further back in history than when they raised the sales tax, both Governor Hanson in the 60s and Governor Hathaway in his first couple of years, they actually raised taxes on people. It was gas tax and a whole series of things. And there was no voter revolt over it. And there was no voter revolt when they raised the sales tax. But it was a different time because you now have an entire history of all of the data showing that we're among the least taxed people in Wyoming in terms of, or in America relative to state provided and locally provided services. But at the same time, you have this sort of, oh my God, we're paying too much. And I think that mythology that we're overtaxed needs to be dealt with before you're going to get people to talk about constructive solutions. As long as we sit around and talk about we pay too much taxes, we can do that among ourselves, but not if we're talking to anybody from any other state. And here in this county, it's a perfect example. The people who have land, agricultural land in Nebraska versus agricultural land in Wyoming, they don't like the comparison because they pay a lot more in Nebraska. The other thing that I think we're not willing to accept is we are so fundamentally subsidized. Depending on which data you use, we pay for 15% or 18% or 20% of the services, but that is a small amount compared to citizens in other states. The thing that struck me when I was governor, we'd go out recruiting, trying to talk to businesses. We'd talk about a really favorable tax climate. And ultimately, it was not persuasive. I mean, we're always, I don't know, first, second, or third in the least taxed, both business and individuals. And you make that pitch, and I did it because we went out looking for gun manufacturers. And what the response was simply was, look, and this guy literally, he points at a machinist. He said, if I lose this machinist, I can have a new one in 3 days. And I'd say, well, we got job training money and all of that. And he just said, look, I'm not in the job training business. I'm in the gun business. His point being that the critical mass of workers who are available to help support those industries if they move here is not present. And so you end up with a sort of, I was surprised how hollow it rang that the tax environment was so favorable. They wanted to know about communities, they want to know about schools, they wanted to know about healthcare, because they want to have a workforce that they can keep and retain. And it became apparent to me that low taxes, which I ballyhooed about it when I was governor, trying to get people here, was simply not the panacea that we had come to believe it was. And I think the whole low taxes thing is our fundamentally being selfish about what we're willing to pay for, as opposed to a fundamental sort of benefit in terms of attracting industry. I mean, if it were a benefit in terms of attracting industry, we wouldn't have lost. I mean, we lost population 4 decades in a row. The population in Wyoming in the 1970s grew as much as it did in the next 4 decades. And so it's a little difficult to, and now I don't know whether we're net losers now, but we probably are, even though we have quite a few tax immigrants moving in.
Great, thank you both. I think we've gotten a lot of questions in the chat and the Q&A, so I'm going to try to combine a couple. We have a couple of questions on how do we educate the public in a way that taxes are actually funding our services and not punishing us. How can organizations like the Equality State Policy Center market that to folks? And then as we consider the importance of educating our public, do you see the decrease in local journalism as hindering Wyomingites? So just a general couple of questions about educating and communicating this kind of dense information to citizens.
Well, I might take a small crack at that. I'll tell you one thing that's evident is people believe that the state gets property tax money. They believe that the state is rich and that if we support the property tax initiative that's going to be on the ballot or other property tax measures, that the state will just make it up from reserves. But we need to understand property taxes support local government. They mostly support schools, which there is an element of redistribution in China, but they support all our local governments. So, and there is no mechanism to move money from the state to local governments in a real meaningful way without some substantial changes. And unfortunately, Wyoming, compared to other states, already sends more money from the Cheyenne centralized state money to local governments. Local governments have very poor tools for weathering through this. They have it's going to be very difficult on them. And so, that's really the first part. Journalism, I could go down that for a long time. I appreciate the ones that are still standing out here, the very good ones. I see a couple of them on this call even, but the lack of good journalism and the changes in that industry and the fact that everybody's self-selecting their own information is really disturbing to me. I grew up with Walter Cronkite telling the country the news, and now I have everybody that sends me different feeds every day from their very strange perspectives, and I wonder how they don't have a balanced mind.
I actually think the public has a better understanding of what a good deal they have than we want to admit, and they want to hold on to it, and they'd like to make it better. And you know, this is a very popular thing in America now to rail about taxes. But to Cale's point, the history of the state relied on largely on property taxes to begin with, and that was successful. But frankly, starting pretty close to statehood, we began to erode and diminish the property tax base to where the property tax base today is probably less than 15% of what it was, if you include minerals, as it was at the time of statehood in terms of a place to go to raise money. And the people who've been hammered by that the worst are local governments. 10 mills or 12 mills raises a great deal more money at 100% of value than it does at the current 8, 12, or 9, or whatever you want to use. And so it did two things. It reduced their ability to raise money and provide services, and it reduced their ability to bond for large facilities, sewer, water, schools, and the rest of it. And so they naturally turned to the state. And the state then turned to severance tax revenues to meet the needs because the needs are real. When you talk to people, people know that we've got a great deal here in Wyoming in terms of what we get for what we pay. But the way we're clinging to it is to say, well, I'm overtaxed. But in fact, you know, you don't have to talk to anybody who lives elsewhere to realize that we're not overtaxed. We have a remarkable level of services. And at some point, you know, the old thing when Sullivan was in was, well, we're going to hit the wall. And that was part of the discussion when Geringer was in. And when I first came in, we were pretty broke, but it corrected itself. And so the question is, are we going to have to wait to hit the wall where people find more hospitals closing, less emergency care, the roads not getting repaired before they finally do something? The legislature in Sullivan moved quickly enough on the sales tax to keep that from happening. And nobody ran out and beat them up. They sort of said, yeah, we got to maintain the values that we cherish in the community, a part of which are just government services, rodeos, county fairs, all of those things that make life what it is in Wyoming. Our ability to drive down the road and have a snowplow cleared out for us. We value that, but I think we've come to take it for granted and have bought into the sort of no new taxes and all of those kinds of slogans because we can afford to. Question is, what do we do when we can't afford to, and do we actually wait to hit the wall before we act?
Well, I'm looking at the Q&A here and see a couple of questions. One is about a good question, really. What are the surrounding states doing better than we do? And I know that that's kind of a tough question because we always think we don't compare to any, but we're so different, you know, we're special, and you can't compare what we do with what anybody else does. But I would like to hear the both of you address that a little bit. And I think that another question would be, which of the property tax relief bills that are floating around, are there any that won't do damage, that will do more good than harm?
I think you got to start with Cale on that. I'm old and retired. I'll let him hold forth.
I'm old too. I just still there. Come on. And I do miss you, Governor. Um, First off, this question about the surrounding states. Well, they seem to be doing about everything in some ways better. I'm not saying I want to live there. I don't necessarily. I love Wyoming and love kind of the way we do things. But if you were to look at a couple of indices, one is population growth and the census to the census. Of all the states that touch Wyoming, we grew the least. We actually barely grew. And if you compare the size of our gross domestic product in that same decade, in real terms, our product was actually slightly smaller, and all the other states had increased substantially. Every one of them, every one of the states. So some have income taxes, some have no sales taxes, Montana, for example. And I always try to find the economies that most match Wyoming and try to say, what are they doing different? South South Dakota comes to mind because they're kind of my thinking about what happens if the minerals really do crash. What happens as we respond to global warming as a nation, as a state, and we produce less oil and less coal, probably no coal in maybe a decade. What does that look like? South Dakota's economy, they have a lot of the things that we have. Their property taxes are quite a bit higher, more than double. Their sales tax, about roughly the same range as ours, except for it's a much more powerful tax. They tax many things that we exempt, and they tax a lot of services. And they seem to do fairly well. What was your other question, Sue, with respect to?
Well, they weren't really related. They just kind of.
They didn't seem that related.
The other piece of that was if given the flock of property tax
Oh
relief
yeah, which
bills.
one's the best? I'm not going to be a heavy hitter on the property tax thing. We mentioned, might have been before we even started, but Senator Dockstader had a bill that was narrowly crafted, sort of kicked off all of this. And it really looked at, I thought it was the most constitutional. It was really a needs-based property tax break. And honestly, that's where my heart is. And I'll look for that. That's pretty much it. Yeah, there are definitely situations where people have been in their home a long time. Their income levels have changed. They want to remain in their homes. I want them to remain in their homes. There are ways that we can work with that. But the idea that someone that is moved here, got the greatest break on the real estate of their lives, and now is grumbly about property taxes, that it might be a third of where they came from. I'm not too excited about that tax break. And I think that does a lot of damage to not just our income, but our psyche. We're better people than that.
On the question of the other states, in addition to the points that Cale raised with regard to population and the gross state product, I think what they have done, and sometimes out of necessity, they have broadened their tax base, particularly the application of the sales tax. They have allowed local governments greater flexibility in terms of raising money than our Constitution does. We destroyed the tax base, but didn't change the Constitution in terms of the mill levy limits. I'm not as pessimistic as Cale is about the future of the mineral industry. I mean, we're a commodity state, and we need to be proud of that. I don't have any reservations about that. But we need to understand that we became a coal commodity state by virtue of the passage of the Clean Air Act. And this point was brought home to me quite forcefully by my friend Joe Manchin when he was governor of West Virginia and I was governor of Wyoming. He still railed about the impact of the Clean Air Act and the subsequent amendments to shift coal production from Appalachia and the Midwest to largely to Wyoming. And that was in part due to an amendment that Senator Simpson got in that allowed coal switching to low sulfur coal. Now we're moving in a different direction, and So you see the coal production emphasis shifting back to the Midwest and to Appalachia. And the point I'm trying to make is the other states seemed more focused on a broad tax base as they evolved over time, whereas we focused entirely on increasing severance taxes, reducing our tax burden, and ending up in a position where we're so dependent. And, you know, we can do some things, I think, to reduce government expenditures, but basically not enough to get us to the point where we enjoy a lot of these services that are essential. I mean, we can all pick out a service or two and say, why are they doing that? I don't get it. You know, but in the end, you know, they're basic things that government needs to perform. As to the measures currently in front of us, I think they ought to continue to expand the eligibility and the funding available in the existing programs, simply because they're focused on the area of need. Most people in Wyoming don't need a tax break, but there are a significant number of people who, and I think we ought to try to help people stay in their home as long as they can. I mean, the importance of that is as they age or they have economic difficulties cannot be understated. And if you think about it, we're better off with people living in their home than shifting over to some form of nursing home or other kinds of care. So, I mean, it makes a financial argument. And then I would support the constitutional amendment. I agree with Cale. I like what Dockstader came up with at the outset, because it was targeted at the problem, which is how do you keep people in their home? To get out of the house, they had to broaden it with the notion that everybody's going to get tax relief. That constitutional amendment will allow that, but it doesn't mandate it. The legislature can demonstrate some restraint in the context of that constitutional amendment and pass legislation that remains focused on the problem. It doesn't seem right to me that everybody in Wyoming should ride on the backs of people who really need help in order for me to get tax relief. It just doesn't seem right, because there are people who need it. That's not a huge segment of the population, but the real problem is making sure that we focus on providing the assistance to the people who need it, as opposed to providing a gift to those who don't need it.
Kind of
But other
like
than that, I'm
the
entirely neutral.
kind of like that ballot initiative that's come up to cut property tax bite in half for everybody. What about the I understand that there was are you talking about the constitutional amendment to separate residential from
Yes,
commercial?
yes,
Okay.
and it allows them to create a subclass. And the
Mhm.
smart thing to do is leave residential where it's at, but create a subclass defined by some sort of level of economic need.
Okay.
And essentially, or do nothing and simply allow the programs we have in place now to expand. And they should. Because I think, like I say, it seems a little inhuman to take people who've lived in their house forever and they fall on, you know, relying on Social Security and a little bit of retirement, and suddenly the values go up. Yeah, they go up. But it doesn't seem right to force them to sell their home.
Yeah. Marissa, what's going on in the chat? I don't have that window in front of me.
Yeah, there's a lot of good conversation happening in here, so thank you all for submitting your questions. I have one from the beginning of the webinar. It's specific and for Dave. It says, your book suggests that the current Wyoming property tax structure conflicts with the Wyoming Constitution's requirement that everyone within a tier be treated equally. One, did I get that right? And if so, can you please elaborate?
No, what the book says is that for 90 years, we had an unconstitutional tax structure. And it afforded everybody tax relief except minerals. I mean, we made sure that minerals paid. And I'm fine with that. That, you know, makes sense. But that was finally challenged in 86, 87 by Ramoga and some of the other industries. as being unconstitutional for exactly that reason. Constitution required that everybody be treated the same. So the Supreme Court, as you'd expect, unanimously said this is all unconstitutional and has been since 1900. And instead of addressing the problem and saying, all right, let's try to go back to the Constitution, we just changed the Constitution to create these different tiers of property and gave the legislature authority about how to value them. So for 90 years, it was unconstitutional, but we enjoyed it. So then it came up to how do you solve it? We ain't going back to the Constitution because that would mean we'd all have to pay more. So we just took the then de facto tier system and made it constitutional. In 1988, that constitutional amendment passed.
Thank you. And I have another question. Maybe we'll start with Cale first on this one. Wyoming has a long history of attempting to diversify its economy and stabilize state revenue. There's a couple of examples here how we have cycled through some different programs. How can you envision discontinuing this cycle so that we do not continue having the same conversation in 10, 20, 50 years with more additions to the list of inadequately effective attempts? And that kind of jumps off of another question on economic diversification is something that is missed in that conversation, is that when we try to bring people to Wyoming, we actually lose money on the people that are coming. How do we make sure that these facts are front and center in the narrative? So two slightly different economic diversification questions. And then, yeah, Cale, we'll start with you if that's okay.
Well, those are good. Everybody in Wyoming knows that we are too narrowly focused. And they would like to see more development, more activity, broader economic availabilities and opportunities. But we've just kind of been miserable at getting that job done. In the end, it might come back to our tax structure, that our tax structure doesn't really support getting that job done because we don't, for one, people that move here know that they think this is a very transitory existence. And even now, more than ever, the governor talked about his going and seeking people and bragging about our low taxes to bring them in. And that somehow didn't work. It's more about our livable communities and on and on and on. But we did do a study. The Revenue Committee actually commissioned it when I was one of the chairmen. And we learned that if we took the same economic development recruitment effort and put it in, I think we had 4 or 5 different states and said, let's recruit this industry with this many jobs. And we had a perfect example in Wyoming that we pretended like was in other states. And we found that in every other state but Wyoming, when that industry came and hired employees and put roots in a community, they were net contributors in every state but Wyoming. Because we all are not, and we don't contribute proportionally to our tax structure. We are all subsidized in some extent, thanks to the mineral industry, that when we recruit someone in, we actually make it worse. We don't make it, we don't create bigger economic opportunity in terms of a broader tax structure. We actually continue to increase our reliance on the mineral industry. So it's totally counterintuitive in some sense, but the more people we recruit that are mineral industry dependent makes the state more dependent on the mineral industry. And I just want to add to the governor, I'm also, I believe our minerals are going to have a great future. It's not going to be the future that we wanted, but the writing on the wall is in for coal plants. And Wyoming coal only goes to be burned for electric power. And so we've had a tax on that electric power for decades, and it's called the severance tax. And it's going to go away unless there's some magic out there. And I know that people are looking for the magic with carbon sequestration and other things, but I'm not that confident. With respect to oil production, oil is going to be pretty valuable, but I'm kind of inclined to believe that there's a really good possibility that in 10 years, most new cars are going to be electric vehicles, not petroleum powered vehicles. And I might be wrong. It might be a different percentage, but that's going to be different. But I'm also seeing restrictions from the federal government on the ability to produce oil and gas on our public lands. And that's wrapped into the equation too. So at least in terms of oil and coal, I'm having trouble finding optimism there. There may be other minerals to replace it, and we've got plenty of gas, but unfortunately, so does everybody else. And so that's where I come out on that. I hope that answers your question, Marissa. Thank you for those.
Well, Cale, you and I'll have to argue about this offline.
Let's get after it.
I have a different sense about where this is going to end up, certainly going forward. But I do think that this stuff on carbon capture and sequestration is not a particularly good investment on the part of the state. I mean, federal government's putting billions into it, and they still haven't tackled it. But I do think there's a role for coal as base load. Anyway, we'll argue about it some other time. The question about economic diversification, the math is exactly what Cale says. And so you find a lot of local governments who are really enthused about economic development and diversification. But that enthusiasm is somewhat more limited if you look at the percentage of state dollars actually invested in it versus invested in other things. And so we've never been forced to confront the problem because, in fact, we could afford to subsidize some of these smaller enterprises that are coming in that don't bring a commensurate tax base. That's gonna become more and more difficult. I think that the other issue is we've not invested in, you can use whatever phrase you like, livable communities or however it is, but places where people want to live. And you look around the region and they have attracted businesses who can count on there being some kind of reliable capacity to retain a workforce in those communities. And we have essentially made communities beggars of the state for funding. And that makes it difficult for them to have the investments. You know, there are a few communities that are doing fine, communities with some joint powers agreements with the county and some of that. They're able to pay for some things, but by and large, we have set it up that the local governments lack a lot of the resources they would need to be independent and to build the communities they want. I mean, they come down, as Cale knows, they come down, talk to the legislature, and the legislature will throw them a bone or two and give them some money and you know, pat themselves on the back. But the question of sustained, reliable resources for communities to develop themselves has yet to be addressed. And when that began to disappear was 1900, when we did away with the tax base upon which they were most dependent. And it wasn't until I think 67, maybe when Hathaway increased the sales tax, that they ever included local governments as part of that distribution. It expanded over time, but in fact, you know, decisions about where to locate plants become very localized. I mean, that was the other thing I learned is they want to, the industrial locators are very much focused, not so much on a state as they are on a community, because that's where the business is going to be located and where they're going to try to hold on to their workforce. So the emphasis on centralizing decision-making in the legislature is the natural consequence of eroding the tax base available to local governments and leaving them a kind of beggar their neighbor to come to the state.
Wow. Yeah. I'm just trying to process all of that. That's a lot. I'm thinking about Brenda Henson's presentation for us in October, she was very clear about property taxes being, that's supporting counties and municipalities.
And schools.
And schools, yes, that's huge. But of course, you want an educated population to make your communities livable. So that's kind of grassroots too. And then the state runs off of sales tax, severance tax, and investment earnings. All of that looks really vulnerable to downturns in industry when we do have such a narrow tax base. So that's that keeps me up at night sometimes thinking about that. We have people who've asked a lot about the why can't we spend reserves to support all of these things we want to do? Can you speak to the rainy day fund and some of that other investment earnings that partially power the state, but also are there for other things?
Well, I'll start, Sue. I think we have to realize we do have substantial reserves. They're different. We have a permanent mineral trust fund, and the earnings off the permanent mineral trust fund we invested it well. We have a spending policy off a small portion of those earnings, and those earnings are a substantial contributor to our ongoing state budget now. That didn't used to be. And back when our Constitution just limited us to being involved in basically treasury bonds and instruments of the federal government that paid very little money. Since we've evolved into a more of a holistic kind of capital structure that involves stocks and bonds, we've done very well, and we're managing it pretty darn well overall, better than any other, of a lot of the economies in the world. Our rainy day fund is more kind of short and immediate. But if you actually were to say, how long could we go if we started eating into that? What if minerals really did tank? What if the federal government were successful in stopping new oil and gas wells? That would take about maybe each year, because of the reduced production from especially oil, you would see a decline, and soon it would just be 2 or 3 years we'd be needing that money really significantly. And if my thinking about coal, there's two things going there. We can look and we can say that these power plants, most of them have a scheduled retirement date, and the longest ones are out about 12 years. There's a couple of exceptions, but what we're not realizing is that even those plants, because of the prolific nature of renewables and natural gas-fired electricity, those plants aren't going to run as much, even though we might want them to, but they're just not going to. And so that's going to start cutting into our coal revenues. So if you just dial in and think, well, half of our wealth in Wyoming, half of our income is basically derived from minerals in some way, even local governments with both property tax, when you roll that in, but the state with property tax, lease bonuses, and severance tax, it's huge. So all of a sudden, the size of our needs in a 5 or 6 year span, where it could be pretty dire until our economy, we magically change it, it could really go through the funds that we have. So yeah, the rainy days fund is big, and we could all smoke cigars and go out in a big way and give property tax relief and burn it up in a couple of years. We could do that, and it might be we probably need the mineral industry to tank at the same time, and then we'd have about 2 years of good cigars. I don't think that's really the way we want to do things in Wyoming. I think we want to be wise. We don't know what the next decade's going to look like. I have no idea. I don't know what the appetite for the legislature is going to be in this world. I do know that we're going to have to fund services. We're going to have to keep the schools open. And I'm not seeing the upside. I'm only seeing potentially a downside, and maybe that's a pessimistic way of looking. But we don't tax the new electricity resources, for example. We're not taxing renewables like we tax electricity now with the coal severance tax. And so that's the way things are going to happen in the future. And we're not poised to be part of that unless we make a change.
Can we tax the renewables, or would that just be going down the same path that got us in trouble in the first place?
I think we need to be very wise about how we tax going forward. But remember, we imposed a severance tax on minerals to compensate future generations for something that they no longer would have, which would be our vast mineral resources. Their opportunity to sell those in the future and mine them and use them, it's gone because it's not in the ground anymore. The same is true about some of our opportunities with respect to the severe landscape needs of renewables in Wyoming. I mean, we now there'll be 3 major transmission lines, 2 that are well underway and by Rocky Mountain Power. And, one is nearly complete and the other one is soon to be complete. They'll be bringing those into rate base over the course of probably the next year. And they're only designed to take out vast amounts of renewables produced in Wyoming, mostly wind. But we don't tax that very well. And I think that we'd be better off shifting to a new structure. And by the way, the third new transmission line is going to be for the largest wind farm in North America, which will be the Anschutz projects by Rollins and Saratoga. None of those are going to be taxed now, but there will be a proposal in the legislature this year to tax the gross receipts of electricity, to get away from thinking about taxing severance and coal, but just tax the gross receipts of electricity. We will always be producing electricity here, unless the wind changes and the sun somehow doesn't come up in the morning. And it's going to be a very desirable place, a lot for permitting reasons. You just saw where the BLM proposed that we now have more rapid permitting for solar installations in Wyoming on top of really dramatic growth in wind. If you look at the Industrial Siting Council and see how many wind projects are in the queue, you'd be astounded. They have huge consequences for Wyoming's landscape, our revenues, on and on and on. So why don't we start taxing the gross receipts of electricity? And make sure what the good part about that is, yes, we'll pay it in Wyoming, but also will all the other people that benefit from electricity that's produced in Wyoming. It's a good thing. And it's a good thing. It's not anti-renewable in the sense that it's protecting Wyoming's future. How are we going to build roads, schools, all of this thing? But here's a point that I want to add. We also have a sales tax on electricity sales in Wyoming. So as part of this whole effort, I'm saying, you know what, Wyoming people, we could get rid of that sales tax on the electricity you purchase in Wyoming. But at the same time, you're going to have to start paying this gross receipts tax, which everybody will pay that benefits from electricity generated in Wyoming. It really is, it won't hurt us anymore. But it'll begin to collect revenues that we can use for decades to come. And I really believe the time to do it is now. And there will be some effort this session.
With regard to renewables, we have a small tax on wind, nothing on solar. But I want to sort of take that question apart a little bit, Sue. It's the theory of taxing them is similar to the theory that was used to tax oil and gas and coal under the severance tax. Yes, we bore part of that, but in fact, I remember there were all these arguments whether it was 83% or 87% of the severance tax, which is paid by consumers outside of Wyoming, but the bulk of it is burdened to them. So what I have trouble with is we don't we think that the passage of the severance tax was the problem. The passage of the severance tax was not the problem. It was the decision that we made as a body politic over 80 or 90 years to not tax ourselves commensurate with that. If we had retained our existing property tax system as it existed in 1900, where everybody paid on fair market value, with some exceptions, you would end up with more money that could have been put into the permanent funds, because the monies are essentially, all of those are essentially minerally derived. You would have more money in that. Those funds would actually be bigger if over that time period, we had borne a fair share of the burden as citizens. So I'm not in favor of increasing the tax on renewables unless we do it in consent, consistent with our beginning to bear more of the burden. Because Sue's right, isn't that going to just exacerbate the problem? That is, extend our ability to rely on somebody else. Whereas if we begin to accept, we have this cowboy ethic and all of this, I pay my debts, and we don't litigate, and we pay for our own way. If we actually did that, you would have permanent funds that are far larger than they are today. And I think part of the reason that the legislature and the governor are obsessed with saving money is they haven't a clue what else to do with it. In the sense of, what would you do to actually diversify the economy, as opposed to add to the savings? And I think savings are a great idea. We all do it with our family budgets. But on the other hand, we also make investments in terms of educating our kids and trying to have a business that functions and all of that. But I think the hardest part is the two hardest factors to deal with is, am I willing to bear a greater burden for the services I receive and make good on this sort of cowboy Western ethic of, we pay our way and we, all of that. And secondly, that we capture these revenues, whether it's from minerals or somebody else, and we continue to save parts of it. Right now, we're doing neither.
Wow, so many great ideas popping up here, and the chat and the Q&A. I'm sorry we haven't had time to address everybody's comments. But I think, gentlemen, you have certainly talked about how Wyoming's taxes determine Wyoming's future. And I think, Marissa, if you have any kind of closing questions or comments, that would be great.
Yeah, I will say what's kind of going on in the chat is exactly what you just touched on, Dave, that there's this sort of rhetoric about pulling yourself up but from your bootstraps. You should be able to take care of yourself without any of these services. And seems to be a worry among the Q&A and chat that rhetoric is growing stronger. If you had a 1 to 2 sentence reply when you hear that, on the basis of trying to change our tax structure, what would you say back to those folks?
I would say, follow the money and follow the numbers, and you'll discover that the truth is we're undertaxed, overserved, and unwilling to step up and bear the burden. And the same is true with regard to economic diversification. If you make it a penalty on the tax system every time we bring in 100 jobs, the incentive to bring in 100 jobs is removed. So we need to differentiate the politics and the rhetoric about everybody needs a tax relief, and try to be mature enough to say, a bunch of us don't, but there are people who do. Let's address that problem for what it is, and then let's deal with the other question of how much more am I willing to support 30%? Remember, if I support 30% of the cost of the services I get, that is a huge change. Taxpayers say it's 15%, so it would be double. There are other numbers that say we pay 18%. But the point is, are we as people willing to be optimistic? And that's what bothers me about a lot of the legislature and the politics of today. It is way too pessimistic about Wyoming. this state has a great history. And yeah, we've kind of gotten ourselves mired in, but we can recreate an optimistic sense about what Wyoming can be. And I'm troubled by our adopting sort of the national process of the Democrats and the Republicans talking, oh, whoa, the world's going to end, et cetera. World's not going to end if we don't let it. And that's up to us. And I think we got a great future if we sort of, cowboy up.
Well, I think we have great tools that we can use. It's a really difficult political environment, but I'm so optimistic. I sit here and I think of Governor, I can remember a time you vetoed a bill of mine, and I had to bring it back the next year. But we've always learned from each other, and I respect you. Your book is a really good contribution to this space, and you all need to get it and read it. And I kind of came of age. You were a little bit ahead of me, Governor, but I was in grad school working on boom towns and looking at the same federal government largeness coming into the energy world that we were kind of panicked about right at that time. And if you remember in your book, you quote Governor Herschler when he's in 1981 addressed the legislature. And we were worried that all the projects, char fuels, all these coal conversions, all the power plants, the coal slurry pipeline, it's immense development here driven by the federal government and federal energy policies. I'm just looking at what Herschler said. And he said, I'd like to serve notice that I will be equally inclined to resist any federal efforts to compromise Wyoming's future through policies designed to make the state an energy sacrifice area. That was Herschler's words in 1981. I think, I come down to what's Wyoming going to look like? And I look at our big landscapes, and I think we're an energy sacrifice area now, and we got to get a handle on it. And taxing electricity, and really it effectively is taxing electricity exports, is a way to begin to get a handle on it. And I think we'll get a partnership going with our friends on the Freedom Caucus and the right people, because it actually does set a tone, I think, that even they could appreciate. And maybe we can get a dialogue going and get that optimism back. But this is one great book. Everybody get it.
Well, you're too kind.
I like serving with you.
It reads like a damn lawyer wrote it.
There's a bit of that, but you all know my dad was Democratic county chairman for years. He was a business partner of Lester Hunt. We've had two parties that worked together and had good ideas since the beginning of this state, and we can't throw that out the window. And now the two parties, we have three parties. We have a shattering of one of the parties, and we just have to have a dialogue and get together and respect each other and move forward. That is the Wyoming way.
I love that optimistic vision of politics today. Thank you, Cale. I needed that. Well, Marissa, are we doing the outro now?
I think we're doing the outro. Yeah, thank you both so much for being here. And we had well over 100 attendees, so thank you all for coming. Thanks for joining Tax Facts Lunch and Learn with Wyoming Tax Facts and Equality State Policy Center. We would like to thank our sponsor, the Wyoming Community Foundation. Our next webinar will be on March 27th at noon, so please mark your calendars and head over to equalitystate.org/tax to register when that's available. It should be later today since I'm the one putting it up. Thank you all so much, and I hope you all have a great day.
And thank you, Dave and Cale, so much for joining us.
Thank all of you and everybody out there.
You bet. Thank you.